Microbiota means any bacteria that live in a community in a given space. Microbiome is taking into account the environment in which those bugs are living, essentially. We have lots and lots of different environments on our human body. So we've got our gut, we've got our mouth, we've got your nose, eyes, whatever. And each presents a unique environment where different bacteria and fungi and viruses love to live. The gut microbiome is getting the most attention. There's so much rich food that obviously goes through that bacteria love to eat, and it's such a beautiful environment for microbes. The most important things about any microbiome we need to think of humans have never been without microbes. We've always evolved together. What we're talking about here is the old friends theory, which is how our interaction in children with our environment is so important for our immune development, and it's this interaction with the microbial world around us. One of a really interesting one is lactose intolerance. So that can be a genetic deficiency, a lactase deficiency, that you don't make the enzyme to be able to digest lactose, which is in milk. But this is one of the things we really need to think about is a microbiome guardianship, is how do we look after the microbiome in our soil, in our plants, in the environment around us? Because if we're losing species that we don't even know their benefit of to humankind, to animal kind, to the earth, we've got a big problem, really.
Hello and welcome to CNM's Specialist Podcast with me, Bobby Qureshi, CNM's Director of Education. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Debbie Cotton. Debbie is an Australian-trained naturopath and the head of clinical education for Invivo Healthcare, where she specialises in translating research on the human microbiome into digestible, actionable clinical pearls for healthcare professionals. Debbie has been in clinical practice for over 15 years, including time in her private naturopathic practice, the NHS, and as a lecturer. Since joining Invivo in 2018, Debbie has become a highly respected name and figure in the field of the human microbiome. And in today's podcast, we'll be delving into the key microbiomes of the body, looking at what they do for our health, but also how they can be implicated in various diseases. We will be exploring the ways in which we can positively influence our microbiomes through means of diet, lifestyle, and supplementation. Hi, Debbie. Thanks so much for coming onto the podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's honestly an honour to have you here. You're a very close friend of mine as well as colleague, and I do look forward to talking all things microbiome with you today. But before we get stuck into that, why don't you just give our listeners a little bit of an insight into what got you into naturopathy and what got you interested in all things microbiome?
That's a really good question. I like most people, I came to this because of my own journey with my own health, and I got treated by some amazing naturopaths, and I thought this is incredible. And so I started off kind of studying in Australia, doing some herbal medicine and also nutritional therapy there, and it just kind of snowballed from there. It was just that sort of, once I got into it, I just couldn't stop learning.
Amazing. And so how did you end up kind of specialising or becoming an expert in this particular field?
I think for me, the microbiome and naturopathy in general is really about us in relation to our ecosystem and everything around us. And the microbiome is such a massive part of our ecosystem that isn't talked about enough, that I don't think we really appreciate enough how much we need to care for it, to care for our own health. So for me, it really intertwined those ideals of science, but also looking at how we're supporting ourselves in the natural environment as well.
That's a great introduction. So why don't we start by just explaining to our listeners what the microbiome is? And I guess we could say microbiomes because
Yes.
there are multiple microbiomes. So do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So microbiome and microbiota are kind of two words that are thrown around a lot. Microbiota means any bacteria that live in a community in a given space. Microbiome is taking into account the environment in which those bugs are living, essentially. So if you think about the human body, we have lots and lots of different environments on our human body. So we've got our gut, we've got our mouth, we've got your nose, eyes, whatever. And each presents a unique environment where different bacteria and fungi and viruses love to live. So depending on the environment, you're going to attract a certain community of microbes. And this is the microbiome, those two things together.
That makes sense. And where are the key microbiomes in the body located?
Basically, every part of your body has a microbiome. So you've got a left ear microbiome and a right hand microbiome, and they're all going to be different. But the ones we talk about a lot for health are obviously the gut microbiome is getting the most attention. And that's because there's so much rich food that obviously goes through that bacteria love to eat. And it's such a beautiful environment for microbes. And it has a very big impact on our health. But also there's vaginal microbiomes, there's oral microbiomes, skin microbiome. All of these things can have a really big impact on our health.
Amazing. And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? That ultimately the health of the microbiome is a key determinant of the health of the individual. Like you said, we're interconnected. It's all about this ecosystem. And when we think about the fact that every part of our body has a microbiome, it's drawing together this whole picture. And obviously we've got lots to cover today, which I'm really excited to talk about. Why don't we start just by maybe we could focus on the gut microbiome predominantly. What is the purpose of these bacteria? What are they kind of doing for us?
It reminds me of the Monty Python sketch. What do the Romans do for us? So they do a lot. So what we've got to remember is it's a twofold relationship. We provide them a home and we provide them food. So, just the nature of our anatomy is providing an ecological niche in which these bacteria can live and thrive. And by doing so, they make a lot of metabolites. So as they go around their day-to-day business of eating food and reproducing and all those wonderful things that microbes do, those metabolites then become something that we can have inside our body and can impact us. And one of the most important things about, I think, especially the gut microbiome or any microbiome we need to think of humans have never been without microbes. We've always evolved together. So there's never been a point in our evolutionary history where we haven't had the microbes and the metabolites that they make. So, and we can see this in studies basically because if you get a germ-free mouse, it doesn't get the same brain development as one that has its normal microbiota. It doesn't have the same development of milestones that it hits through life. Its immune system doesn't develop in the right way. So our actual physicality of our body is really, really dependent on these microbes. So it's remembering it's another organ within ourselves, really.
And what always amazes me is just to remind ourselves that as individuals, if we look at our body, there are more bacteria in us than there are cells in the rest of our body, which is quite an amazing thought, really, isn't it, when you think about it?
Yeah, it's insane. I think from the last count, I think it's 1.3 times the number of human body cells that's in your body are microbes. Wow,
that's amazing. And you mentioned before a little bit about some different kind of functions, and we've seen that in animal studies, for example. But if we think here about the immune system in particular, this is obviously a really key area. We talk about how 70% of our immune system lives in the gut. So immediately we've got a strong connection there. But how do these bacteria help in terms of our immune development and our immune kind of activity on a day-to-day basis?
So to answer that question, we need to go backwards a little bit to, where do we get exposed to our microbes, which is from being an infant, basically, and through birthing. And we have these windows of development in childhood in which our immune system is very, very open to learning. These kind of windows of tolerance, basically. And what we're doing as we go through these developmental stages is we're learning friend from foe when it comes to microbes, because, we've got a lot of microbes that we live with really happily and they're great for us. And there's the occasional ones that want to take over that environment, which we term pathogens, which are ones that can cause disease and illness. And your body needs to learn that. And that's where your immune system comes in. So there's a lot of crosstalk that happens in the Peyer's patches in the small intestine, but also all the way down there's lots of immune cells that are constantly learning, is this friend, is this foe, and then how do I code for this, and how do I, going through life, when do I worry if something's an insult or not? So there's lots of microbes that live within us that actually send signals to the immune system kind of going, chill out, we're here, all is well. But then when pathogens come on board, they'll send different signals and the immune system will listen and go, oh, okay, I need to set up an inflammatory response to try and get rid of something that wants to invade me.
That makes sense. The way I think of it when I'm teaching is it's a bit like going to school, right? You need to learn through exposure. It's a bit like doing your driving test. You wouldn't just go and do your driving test. You would learn through practice and practice and practice. And I guess through that key development stage as children, we need that exposure for our immune cells to see all of these potential microbes in our environment so that they can learn, so that they're better equipped at dealing with these microbes, these bacteria, whatever they might be. So they can learn, is this a friend or a foe, basically?
Absolutely. And what we're talking about here is a theory known as the old friends theory, or it started off as the hygiene hypothesis, but it's now called the old friends theory, which is brought about by Professor Graham Rook. And if you ever get a chance to read any of his papers, it's beautiful. It's kind of saying how our interaction in children with our environment is so important for our immune development. And it's this interaction with the microbial world around us.
I guess this brings back to this idea that in modern life, we don't see as many kids getting out there, hands in the soil, eating dirt, and, everything now is so sterile. Mm-hmm. Everything's disinfected and everything's plastered in chemicals. So there's obviously a correlation here that does make sense. Going back to what you said before about a very sterile environment, even in a rodent, what we see as the consequence is clear. So I suppose when we look at the rates of eczema and asthma and autoimmune diseases where the body's attacking itself, when these are all increasing, and at the same time we're getting less and less exposure to a variety of different microbes, it sort of makes sense really exactly what that theory's saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And microbial loss, both on humans and in our environment, because we haven't got to the point of knowing everything that's there yet, we almost don't know what we've lost. We know we're losing diversity, is how we term it, the different groups of microbes that are around quickly, but we almost don't even know how that's going to impact us until, we get to the point like now that we're like, oh, these rates are increasing and these are decreasing, and how did that used to protect us?
It's a scary thought, actually, isn't it? It's really interesting, Debbie. I'm definitely keen to talk more about kind of the microbiome as we're developing in childhood, talking a bit about birth. I know these are some great topics, but just to keep us on some of the functions for now, we've obviously spoken about the immune system and that being a big one. In terms of other functions, what else is the gut microbiome, let's say, doing for us?
So one of the things it does is just by pure taking up space in our gut, it excludes pathogens from being able to set up. So it has a kind of a community focus of keeping a healthy community that stops anything else from getting in. So that's one thing. Another thing that it does is a lot of the metabolites it produces are things that our body needs. So some of our vitamins, for example, can be produced by gut microbes such as vitamin K, some of our B vitamins, B12 as well. Some of the metabolites they make, such as something known as short chain fatty acids. This is when microbes eat fiber, basically. They break it down into a small fatty acid, and that the body really uses. The gut epithelial lining uses it as its main fuel source. It's important for brain development. It's important for the immune functioning. So we're really reliant on a lot of what they make for us.
And you make a great point there with the short chain fatty acids, in that they are feeding the lining of your gut, which we call your epithelium. So this is a key point, because if we're not feeding our bacteria and we're not supporting them with lots of fiber-rich foods, for example, then we're not going to create as many short-chain fatty acids, which means we're potentially impairing that integrity of the gut wall. And obviously there are many implications. We can talk a little bit about that later if you like.
Absolutely.
But I think a great topic. I think short-chain fatty acids probably is a podcast in its own.
It is a podcast in its own right.
So I love what we're talking about here. You've also mentioned there about how we're producing vitamins. Vitamin K, I mean, that's a great example. So if, for example, somebody had an imbalance in their gut bacteria, what we're saying here is that you could therefore have less vitamin K being produced and hence absorbed.
Yeah, exactly. These can lead to nutritional deficiencies. One of a really interesting one is lactose intolerance. So that can be a genetic deficiency. If you listen to the Emma Beswick podcast, you may have heard of her talking about a lactase deficiency, that you don't make the enzyme to be able to digest lactose, which is in milk. But equally, bifidobacterium makes its own lactase. So if you've got a really good colony of bifidobacterium, and even if you're genetically a bit lactose intolerant, you might just be able to still cope with a little bit of milk in your diet or lactose in your diet because the microbes are helping you out with the digestive function as well. So they play many, many roles in contributing to our overall health, and also the metabolites and the things that we need in our body to function.
Wow. I didn't know that about bifidobacterium actually and lactase. That's amazing. And I mean, bifidobacterium is a species we often hear of. I mean, you see it on, certain food packaging. You see it obviously in the supplement industry. It's a big bacteria. Just sort of zooming in on this one, just for a second. What is it about bifidobacterium that's so special?
I guess bifidobacterium and its friend lactobacillus are the two most common ones that are used, like you say, in food supplements. But also, bifidobacterium is one of the first to colonize in infants. It's really good at the reason it can digest milk sugars is because breast milk is really, really rich in lactose. So it's really, really helpful at kind of that initial stage of communicating with the immune system, telling the immune system, hey, all is well, but also making some of these metabolites that are really important for gut development in infants, your immune tolerance, and so on and so forth. So this is why it's quite a common one that we talk about when we talk about human health, but it is only one species of many that are really, really important as well. But it is one, obviously, you can find in sometimes even in yogurts if you're lucky. It's normally lactobacilli, but sometimes there might be bifido in there as well.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for that. And we've obviously been talking around the subject of kind of early colonization of our gut and, starting off life. So if we just go right back to the beginning, one area that we do hear discussed quite a lot is what would the implications be of having a natural birth versus a cesarean section in terms of that early colonization? So what would you say to that?
So there's some great research in this topic, and it's so interesting. So a woman's vagina is really, really lactobacilli rich. So there's lots of lactobacilli generally dominant in that particular area. So when a baby moves through the birth canal, it actually gets impregnated with lots of lactobacilli from the vaginal secretions. If we talk about labour in quite an honest way, there's often poo involved. So there may even be some feces that the baby gets on the way, out. All of this are kind of inoculations of the microbes that will first set up and help to become a part of that baby who will turn into an adult's microbiota. Now, if you're born by a cesarean section, you're obviously not going through the lactobacilli-rich vagina. So what we see in cesarean babies is their microbiome is normally dominated by species that are more on the surgeon's hands when they come out, or also bacterial spores that are in the room. So they normally have a different route of development. So the first colonizers will look different. And again, this can change as we go through as well. So, you've got breastfeeding, and breastfeeding's an incredible thing because actually it contains in there human milk, what we call oligosaccharides, which are special sugars that we make as humans, and all their purpose is to feed bacteria. So we make what's known as a prebiotic, which is a word to say we feed a bacteria. They make bacterial food in our breast milk to attract bifidobacterium, to attract lactobacilli, to attract some of these other early colonizers. So again, this is another point of where maybe breastfeeding can't happen, so it's formula feeding, but that means we're feeding different types of bacteria, so we're going to have different colonization happening. So this is where you can get microbiome development can really go in different ways depending on those really early foundations, and also what mother's microbiome was, what father's microbiome was, or or other mother's microbiome is, who kisses the baby, who is kind of in cahoots with the baby. All of these things are ways that we have that early colonization, and that's your foundation of where your microbiome will end up as an adult.
It's a good point because, of course, the baby is essentially engulfing bacteria from the mum, but if that sort of vagina is dysbiotic, meaning it's imbalanced, again, that means that we're potentially inheriting microbiota that are not quite the species that maybe we were expecting to have, that we would ideally have. So Very interesting. If somebody does have a C-section then, from your kind of clinical experience and your clinical approach, what would you do in terms of supporting that person? Do you need to put anything in, or do you leave it as it is?
So I think that is really dependent on the next steps. So if someone's going the breastfeeding route, it will normally very quickly, that can help a lot in kind of getting the microbiome back to where it should be in many ways. There are two kind of interventions that are getting studied and need more studying at this stage, which can be done as well. So one is giving kind of baby-specific probiotics. Bifidobacterium infantis is quite a common one at this stage to try and encourage that bifidobacterium colonization to happen. The second one, which is getting more research and is really interesting, is using vaginal fluid and actually rubbing it on the baby to make sure that it gets impregnated basically with some vaginal fluid anyway. And the safety of that is not 100% tested yet, but there's definitely some really good research studies moving in that direction, kind of looking at a vaginal microbiome transplant basically on the baby. The only worry about that is if there's Streptococcus B, which is quite common in the vagina, is in there in high amounts, that can obviously give an infection. So that's one of the things that they're a bit worried about. How can they do this safely going forward? And that might end up as, a specific set of probiotics that, and probiotics means bacteria that are good for you, basically, that we can then, give to the baby at that time.
That's amazing. And so if you had somebody that, let's just say, is born via C-section, they're not breastfed, what are they potentially more likely to develop?
Well, allergies is one thing that's really, really common in kind of disturbed microbiomes in infants. So there's been many studies, again, looking at giving probiotics to pregnant mums and also to infants to try and improve immune tolerance as quickly as possible. But also a lot of it is we don't know. We don't know where that's ending up. We know dysbiosis, which is the word that's used for an imbalanced microbiota, can be linked to many conditions like autoimmune conditions, obesity, type 2 diabetes, leaky gut conditions, all these sort of things. But it's very, very hard to kind of follow because there's so many things that can weave in a lifetime to kind of say X equals Y, but we do know it's involved.
I think it's fair to say that this is quite a new area, relatively speaking. I mean, going back to when I did my master's degree, I don't think microbiome was even a word mentioned. And at the time, of course, probiotics 10, 15 years ago were being spoken out a little bit more, but kind of it felt like quite generic. It was sort of like, go and have a probiotic yogurt, take this probiotic. But it really feels as though in the last, 10 or so years, and please do correct me on this, there's really been a very quick evolution in our understanding of what the microbiome is, what it does for us, what the implications are when it's imbalanced. And so what is that? What's changed in such a short period of time?
So the science has changed. So there was something called the Human Microbiome Project, which I'm going to say is 10 years ago, but it's probably 20 now because it was showing my age. But basically what that did was it was able to utilize DNA technology to be able to look for all of the microbes that are in the microbiome. Because before that, the technique we had for working with the microbiome was called culturing. And what you have to do with culturing is you need to get a sample, you need to grow it in a petri dish. So it's got to kind of be able to, first of all, you've got to get that sample to have enough bacteria in. It's got to survive to the petri dish. It's going to want to grow on that medium to be able to get a result. So therefore, you're only getting a very, very skewed result of what bacteria will grow in that particular medium at that particular temperature with air or not with air. So now that we can kind of seek DNA sequence, so basically looking at the DNA of what microbes are there, we found all of these species that we had no idea existed. And that gives you massive data sets where you can then start looking and correlating between disease processes and these different species, and also looking at kind of, what they do and how they how they work. There's another level of science now on top of this, which really looks at metabolomics. So it's looking at how these bacteria metabolize. So therefore, what are they making and how do they contribute? It's just mind blowing. And so I think you'll see this science will just feed clinical interventions going forward over the next 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, you can see that. I mean, the companies, obviously you work for Invivo. I mean, the technology that you're using there is incredible, and the tests that you're creating as a result, you're able to create are amazing, simply because of the fact that, like you explained, the science is there now. We understand it, we can use it better. So that's fantastic. What I did want to ask you as well, just in terms of the bacteria, is where do these originally come from? Where are these originating from? Obviously, we spoke about birth coming from mum, but where is mum getting it from? If we go right back to the start, where is this all coming from?
Good question. I would need my colleague here, Emily Blake, who is an anthropologist, how do you say that? Apologist, to be able to tell us some of this. But actually, they've always been in our environment. They've always lived with us. So our microbiome is dependent really on two major things. It's your parental lineage and who you've had associations with in the community, and the environment in which you are born into. So what's really important there is where you live in the world, and we can get even more specific than that. Do you live in the city? Do you live in the country? It all has different impacts and will impact the microbiome differently. And what's so interesting, like families will have microbe sets that are really specific to them, that maybe no one else will have. So it is, even though there's a large part of the microbiome that's very similar across humans, there are some subsets of it that are really, really unique as well.
Wow. And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of bacteria are being formed and colonized in soil.
Yes.
So then it's kind of coming through plants, etc. And I guess this then makes us think, what's going on in the soil? What are we doing to the soil? And I think this is a really good point to highlight from what you said in terms of how we're looking after our ecosystem, how we are sort of engaged with our environment. And obviously, if we are spraying pesticides on our soil constantly, if we're damaging soil, depleting the soil of nutrients, trying to grow plants super, super quick, faster than they can cope with, I guess the end result is not just that our food is rich with pesticides and perhaps less nutrient sort of abundant, but also that we're impacting the microbiome, and that can then have a subsequent effect on all of these things.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that I think we're at a crux really environmentally for many reasons. But this is one of the things we really need to think about is our microbiome guardianship is how do we look after the microbiome in our soil, in our plants, in the environment around us? Because if we're losing species that we don't even know their benefit of to humankind, to animal kind, to the earth, we've got a big problem, really.
I agree. Well, one thing that we can definitely do to help with this is to get a pet.
Yes.
Because having pets are a fantastic way of supporting a microbiome. And I've got a little 1-year-old at home. And one thing we always wanted in our household was to make sure we had a dog so that he gets lots of exposure. And he definitely does get way too much exposure from all the slobber. But tell us a little bit about that and the whole interaction with pets.
Absolutely. So any interaction with the natural world, so pets, babies eating soil, there was a great research article about that actually, most kids will put dirt in their mouth or stones in their mouth at some point. All of these things are another way of enabling a exposure to a larger group of microbes, which then again teaches the immune system, is this friend or foe? And if you don't have that exposure in those early years, when you get later in life, there's a possibility that your body will go, this is a foe, this is a problem. And this is where allergies can set up, and eczema and all these things as well, because the body starts reacting to microbes it hasn't come across before. So these really early years are quite pivotal for getting these sort of interactions. And yeah, pets are super important.
I agree. A great way. The interesting thing I read, actually, just coming slightly back to the soil point, was that I read something, I can't remember where it was now, but it was speaking about how the bacterial composition of soil can significantly change the taste of the plants that they grow. And subsequently, it's one of the reasons that if we go to different parts of the world, we get such different flavors from our food. Again, coming back partly to the bacterial species, which is another amazing thing that they're doing for us.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? It's like all of these things that they do for us that we don't even realize.
Yeah.
And that's just, something we really want to preserve.
That's amazing. And one thing I'd like to point out here, especially for those listening, is hopefully they've really got the message already that there are so many amazing benefits of bacteria to our health, and they're fundamental for us being healthy. I've certainly been brought up in a household where if you mention bacteria, it's a very negative thing. It's an infection. It's bad. It's coming back to what we call the germ theory.
Yes.
So the germ theory is very much about how a microbe, a bacteria or a virus, whatever it is, causes a disease. But what we're really talking about here is more of a traditional kind of naturopathic concept, which is the terrain theory. And we're more looking kind of at the environment. What's the ecosystem? I think that's a great word to use. What's the health of that ecosystem? So I think that's a really key point to make, that it is all about the environment, and what we're trying to do as naturopathic practitioners, as people in this field, is trying to optimize the health of the host, because that's one of the best ways of then supporting the health of the bacteria that reside in it.
Absolutely. We want to support the host. We want to support the microbiome by feeding it the things that it needs. We want to make sure that we're exposing ourselves to all of these healthy species as well, because if they're taking up space, you start to exclude pathogens as well. There's always kind of bad luck. You're a bit run down, you're a bit stressed, your microbes are a bit deficient, you come across E. coli from a chicken or something and you get food poisoning. There's always those possibilities. But equally, the more robust you are, the quicker you'll deal with that. Or in some cases, maybe your microbiome's strong enough that it doesn't grow in the first place. So, these are the things that we're really trying to encourage, is that kind of underlying sense of robustness in your microbiome.
Makes sense. So why don't we talk a little bit about what will negatively influence the microbiome? Because I guess if we think of ourselves as practitioners, if somebody comes into our clinic and they present with symptoms that we think the microbiome is implicated, which it pretty much always is, in one way or another, we're trying to understand why has this microbiome potentially become imbalanced. So what are some of the key things that you would look for in terms of things that would have a negative impact?
So food is one thing. So the microbiome needs its own set of foods. It needs lots of fiber, and it needs its own kind of special sugars that it digests. And if we're not putting those into our kind of everyday diet, we see communities dying back and others flourishing that are not necessarily, they're okay if they're in small amounts, but it's when they kind of overtake the rest of the community can actually start to become a bit of a concern for us. So that's number one, is actually the fibers and that's kind of plant food basically that we're feeding our microbiome. Equally, it's our exposure to microbes as well. So food is another great exposure to healthy microbes as well as unhealthy. We can also pass on, the odd pathogen through food, but most of the time we're actually passing on, good commensal bacteria. Now, whether or not they stay in the microbiome or not they may or may not hang around, but actually just the act of them moving through our gut and the metabolites they make will encourage the growth of your own microbiome in a really, really healthy way. Where we live and our environment and, the kind of chemicals we use in our home, whether or not you have pets, do you interact with green spaces, do you touch soil? All of these things can be a really important way of really working with your microbiome. So if you're kind of missing any of those things, there may be a deficiency in the microbiome, basically. Makes
complete sense. And just going back to food, what would you consider to be the worst culprits? What are the things that you just go, yeah, that's going to do some damage?
So ultra-processed foods are generally going to do the most damage. So anything that's highly refined, because it generally has very, very simple sugars in it, and it's only going to feed certain type of bacteria. So that's one thing. But also a lot of the additives that are added into ultra-processed foods and the emulsifiers are known to damage the gut microbiome. There was just a study last week that came out around artificial sweeteners, actually, and how they can really impact the gut microbiome and in a negative way. So it's just being aware that actually some of these things, it's not even that they're just not feeding our microbiome, it's actually that they're actively damaging as well. Obviously, the use of medications such as antibiotics or other medications, and sometimes we can't avoid that, but that will have an impact on the microbiome as well that we need to think about and think about how do we recover from.
That's made so much great information. There's two things I want to come back to.
Okay.
Definitely antibiotics, but also just going back to the artificial sweeteners. I mean, I remember looking at some sort of literature around xylitol and how xylitol it was hypothesized that it has a negative impact on the gut microbiome. But from what you read in terms of artificial sweeteners, what was it that came up on there? Were there particular sweeteners that seemed to be problematic, or was it, I don't know if you remember.
I'd have to go back to the paper to remember. I'm sure it was sucralose is a problem, aspartame was a problem. It was 4 that they did, and I can't remember the other 2. And that was a really big, there's been a few of those papers it was just quite a big, clear cohort study that just happened, and the results got published last week.
Wow.
So we can always post a link to that or something along those lines.
Sounds great. That sounds great. It's a really good point, because a lot of people that are trying to cut down on their sugar, which of course is the big, and quite rightly so, big message, will then opt for alternatives which they think are going to be beneficial. But unfortunately, as we know, they generally aren't. And this is a good bit of evidence to support that theory. So that's really interesting. Antibiotics, I mean, this is such a big one. And I don't know if you do, but I always ask in a case history, tell me about antibiotic use. And I don't think I've ever had a patient say, oh no, I've had no antibiotics. Or if they do, you then say, okay, go back to teenage years, go back to childhood. Because of course, this is something that we've all been sort of raised with, a lot of exposure to. Just how big a problem do you think antibiotics are?
So they're both a lifesaver and a massive problem. And, the thing is, there's been, again, some amazing longitudinal studies, really long-term studies on the use of antibiotics in childhood and how then in later life it really correlates with lots of different diseases. Martin Blazer was one of the researchers that was involved in that research, and it's actually quite scary and phenomenal. But yes, antibiotics, obviously, if you've got a raging infection, they're lifesavers. That's what they're for. But equally, a lot of antibiotics will knock out large portions of the microbiome. Now, your microbiome is really good at growing back and normally grows back quickly. But what we don't know is, have we lost some of those really unique species that were unique to you? And also in the growing back phase, sometimes it doesn't grow back like it should. And this is where, again, we get problems with the microbiome becomes more of a pathogen than it does something that supports us. And this is where we can get long-term problems. This is also happening in our food production, where antibiotics are being used with things like poultry that have been over-farmed. If they're living in close quarters, they're giving lots of antibiotics. It creates superbugs. Like, bugs are really, really good at kind of going, oh, okay, I've got your number. I'm going to evolve to try and avoid that. And then we ingest that superbug, and that antibiotic doesn't work for us anymore, and we get these kind of ongoing problems. So it's creating a vicious cycle. So they're important, but also we need to be guardians of antibiotics and make sure that they're only used when they need to be used. They're not used for the wrong things like viruses, because viruses obviously are immune to antibiotics. They just don't work on that. And it's kind of being gatekeepers of thinking, do I need this? And if I do, make sure it's being utilized properly. You're doing the whole course, and hopefully that you're doing other natural supportive things alongside to make sure you're not getting that kind of evolution of bacteria into superbugs as well.
Of course. And I think that's where natural medicine plays a big role, right? We can help support people without needing, in terms of sort of chronic states or perhaps less serious states, avoiding them having to go down the route of taking an antibiotic, because we do have a lot of tools available to us. The analogy I give for antibiotic, and the way I teach this, to put it in very simple terms, is imagine you've got a car park, and basically every car in a car parking space is a bacteria, and an antibiotic is like going to Christmas Day where there's no cars left in the car park, everyone's left. And then things can come in and overgrow, and, whether that be candida, the fungus, or whether that be other pathogens like you've mentioned, it just sort of to really visualize what can happen here. So if somebody's had an antibiotic, what would you recommend to help sort of recover from that?
The major thing is prebiotics. So it's making sure you're feeding your bacteria that you want to come back as quickly as possible. So it's thinking about, well, what's some of the important bacterial species that I want? Bifidobacterium, lactobacilli, some of the other short chain fatty acid producers as well. And what do they need? They need fiber. So, and you can get quite specific on fibers. You can get supplements that are quite specific for specific bacteria. For example, galacto-oligosaccharides are very specific for bifidobacterium. But equally, just eating a very, very fiber-rich diet, being exposed to microbes in your food, which we can talk about fermented food in a minute. All of these things can be ways of really coming back. You can use probiotics as well. But one of the things we need to remember about probiotics is what they are. They're incredible tools, but they're not necessarily there to colonize. They're there as you take them. They become alive in your stomach. Not in your stomach, sorry, in your small intestine, large intestine. And those metabolites will have a really, really big impact on the colonies that you grow there. So what they're doing as they're passing through, they're sending immune signals, they're sending metabolites, and all of that thing helps to, for your own colonies to grow back. So you are taking probiotics really to get your bacteria back, but it's not that particular bacteria in the capsule that's necessarily growing there. It's just encouraging the growth of your own.
That's interesting, because I think a lot of people, including myself really, have sort of would think that you're putting the probiotic in and those particular strains are sticking to the wall of the gut and colonizing, but it's quite interesting what you're saying. Yeah, and I think this point with antibiotics is a big one because people don't connect the dots, I find anyway. People say, why are you asking, why are you really that interested in the year of antibiotics I had for my acne as a teenager? So it's quite interesting how there is that missing connection for a lot of people, but we can obviously really tie that together. Environmental toxins as well, I guess we could look at here. Glyphosate, for example, the pesticide, this is a big one, which was originally used as primarily just an antibiotic before a pesticide. I believe that was the way around. So something like that, we've got this coming through our food supply, immediately having an impact on our microbiome.
Absolutely. It has an impact on our microbiome. It has other impacts as well, cellularly as well, but also heavy metal exposure. Like we talked about, different emulsifiers in some of the ultra-processed foods. All of these things can have a really detrimental effect to our microbiome. And a really big one, I guess, is thinking about our environment. We've just had a couple of years of COVID and we've all become very, very good at hand sanitizing, which if you're in a hospital situation, super important, that needs to be done. But if you're using high levels of antimicrobials that don't degrade, like triclosan, for example, that go into our environment, that's going to then affect the microbes in the soil and it doesn't break down. And there's this constant ongoing thing of it being antimicrobial, maybe to microbes that we don't want. So it's really important to have hygiene, but it's also thinking about what are the things that I'm using, what types of soaps am I using when I'm doing my hand washing, and what sort of things am I using in the bathroom, all of these things, because they contribute to your skin microbiome, but you might swallow a bit, but also the microbiome around you that you interact with daily.
That makes sense. Just slightly, I guess, related to that, have you got any thoughts on the impact of face masks and how that may potentially impact the microbiome? Any thoughts there?
There shouldn't be too much of an impact on the microbiome with face masks. There's obviously going to be some what you're breathing in or not breathing in. It's more the social contact in general. So, what we have with the social isolation and the lack of social contact, we're not sharing microbiomes as much. And that's actually the sharing of microbiomes is really, really important. Family members share microbiomes all of the time. And that's actually really important for our immune system as well. Equally, if someone's ill, we don't want to share their microbiome in that short period of time, but that should recover really, really quickly. So I think it's not just the face mask itself, it's actually more the social isolation and the not interacting together that's going to make a massive, massive difference.
Makes sense. So it's sort of everything that comes with that. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the implications of having an imbalanced microbiome. If we perhaps focus on the gut, but we can draw in other microbiomes as you like. What are the big things that we need to be thinking about here as potential consequences?
So the biggest consequences of imbalanced gut microbiomes that we know so far are things like a kind of damage to the gut barrier. So that's the mucosal barrier and also the cellular barrier of the gut.
Just explain that a little bit for our listeners, if you could.
So, we've got all these microbes that live within us, and we do interact with them on a day-to-day basis. But there's only so much bacterial matter that we want in the wider system. So it means we do have to have a very, very good barrier. So on the outside, it's our skin is an important barrier that stops things coming through. Inside our gut, we have a cellular barrier which stops things moving through, like microbes or hopefully chemicals. And on top of that, there's a thick layer of mucus where our own cells make kind of little special peptides or proteins and other things that will stop kind of anything that wants to invade from getting through. So the health of our gut barrier and our mucosal barrier is very, very much linked with our health in general, systemically, because that's your first point of your immune system stopping anything coming in, whether that's microbial, chemical, a food stuff, whatever that might be. So with an imbalanced microbiota, we can really start to damage the gut barrier and the mucosal barrier quite quickly because it may not be getting the metabolites it needs to stay healthy, or you might be making metabolites that are not healthy for it. And they're going to go into your wider system. And when they do, your body starts to set up an inflammatory response, kind of going, hang on, all of this bacterial matter or all of this metabolite is not supposed to be here. And with that inflammatory response, it can become it's not necessarily a high inflammatory response. It can be in cases of things like sepsis, but it's generally in chronic diseases, it's a low grade inflammatory response. And that means that all of your cells are on standby all the time. You're starting to make these kind of inflammatory chemicals in your body, which can then start to disrupt some of our normal day-to-day processes. And if you do that for many, many years, that can lead to things really clearly like type 2 diabetes. It can lead to obesity. It can lead to autoimmune conditions, liver conditions like non-alcohol fatty liver disease, depression. We know when there's kind of too many of these inflammatory molecules in your body that depression and anxiety can also be one of the causes as well. So the health of your microbiome is so, so important as a gatekeeper alongside your gut barrier, basically, for keeping that, hey guys, all is well, keep calm, we don't need to be inflamed around things, and therefore all of the other processes in your body work well. So it's super, super important.
Wow. You summarised that amazingly well. I think the description of this gut barrier is crucial, isn't it? From a very practical perspective, this is what we're dealing with often. And I know when you do for example, your stool tests at Invivo, you're often looking for signs of a degraded barrier, whether it's that mucus, that sort of sticky substance being broken down and thinning, or whether it's that lining of cells, the epithelium, whether that's sort of separating and becoming permeable. This is obviously why a lot of practitioners now are doing testing to try and work out exactly what's going on here. So that makes complete sense. And obviously, if we think about the immune system, we always think the immune system, it's all about balance, as with anything. We don't want it to be underactive, otherwise we end up with, all sorts of illnesses. If it's overactive, however, we end up with allergies and autoimmunity. So when we keep getting all these substances from the gut leaking into the blood, upregulating the immune system, like you said, it's that low-level inflammation where you're then more likely to get things like autoimmune diseases, which of course are just booming, absolutely, through the roof in terms of prevalence.
Yeah. And the one I've obviously forgotten to mention is cardiovascular disease. It's really well known that some of the metabolites that some bacteria can make when they digest high levels of protein can actually make a metabolite that, again, causes a low-grade inflammation, but also can damage the arteries directly.
Wow.
and therefore set up arteriosclerosis and things like that as well. So there can be, a very, very big link in a lot of these disease processes.
And I guess the big driving force here is underpinning this, of course, the bacterial imbalance and that barrier in the gut breaking down. But then I guess it's that driving inflammation. I suppose when you start to get inflammation and it's chronic and it's low level, it's burning away in the background, it's like having a low level, flame underneath something, it's just burning it away. And I mean, certainly, for example, if we are dealing with somebody that does have some sort of heart disease or is at a higher risk, we might actually look for inflammatory markers to see what's their risk looking like, and basing, a lot of the results of that as to sort of assessing what their current risk is. So such a key area. And of course, Hippocrates famously said all disease begins in the gut. I think we're giving some pretty good reasoning for that right now.
Absolutely. And I just kind of want to add, it starts from the gut, but also remembering the gut consists of our oral microbiome as well, which is another route in which bacteria can really communicate with the wider system as well. So there's lots of microbiomes that can have this communication and can cause this sort of low-grade inflammatory picture.
Interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about the oral microbiome?
Oh, absolutely. So a bit like the gut microbiome, our oral microbiome is slightly heredited. So, it comes from mum, also who you've had interactions with as well, but also our diet and what we're exposed to dietary-wise will feed different species that live in our mouth. Now, the obvious thing with the oral microbiome is, if it's imbalanced, can cause things like dental decay, enamel damage, or things like abscesses or tooth infections, gum disease, periodontitis. But equally, this kind of imbalanced oral microbiome, if you think about how thin and permeable your gums are, especially when they're bleeding, is a really direct route into your bloodstream. And it's been very well known for years how many, bacteria can set up infection, even on the heart, like endocarditis, for example, if you've got sort of certain bacteria that get into the bloodstream from there. But recently there's been some amazing research on certain types of bacteria, such as a P. gingivalis, for example, and they've found that some of the metabolites it makes is found in kind of Alzheimer's plaques as well. So it's that kind of that communication of these metabolites that are not so good for us from an imbalanced oral microbiome are causing sort of part of the disease process. It's not just the one thing, it's a combination of all these things that create that process to happen.
Wow. I mean, P. gingivalis, what a nightmare that bacteria is. This is a bacteria, just for everybody, we tend to, when we talk about bacteria, we often get a little bit lazy sometimes, and we can shorten them and maybe just give the first letter, just so you know. So it does have a longer name, which I won't attempt right now. But P. gingivalis is, like you said, it's linked to gum disease. As you said, it's found in the plaques that form in the brain with Alzheimer's. So there's big correlations there. Also rheumatoid arthritis, there's a big link there. And actually I've seen patients where there has been some sort of oral dysbiosis, and that seems to be the key trigger as to what the final domino that got pushed over was to get them to initiate that condition. So it's a big one. It's
a really big one. And at Invivo, we have some amazing scientific advisors, and one of our clinical advisors is a dentist, Dr. Victoria, and she is just sensational at working with people with their oral microbiome. And she's seen some amazing case studies of rheumatoid arthritis, and I think she's even written some of these up for journals, improving by treating the oral microbiome. So, it's just it's that other layer of, yes, there's lots of other things going on too, but it's that extra layer that sometimes can really help.
Wow. I find it, the mechanism, how it does this, just for our listeners, what P. gingivalis does in rheumatoid arthritis is it contains an enzyme, a protein that basically changes the structure of your proteins, and it turns these proteins into things that your immune system just looks at and thinks, well, I don't know what that is. So it starts attacking these proteins, and it just so happens that these proteins are found in your joints. And so this is where you can offset this big immune response. And it's just, quite an amazing mechanism, really. And I won't geek it out too much on this one. But yeah, P. gingivalis. And I guess, of course, you guys do offer microbiome testing as well for the oral cavity as well as the gut.
Yeah, oral, gut, vaginal. We're always looking at the multiple microbiomes because, there's many, many ways in which the microbiome can impact us.
Interesting. Another one actually that I have researched before is the link with fertility, because I know I read in a couple of studies actually in the last few years that the oral microbiome is a determinant of the microbiome that we see in the placenta associated with placental health. Which, when you think about it, we strip it back. What we're basically saying is that the health of the mouth is a key determinant of the health of the placenta, which is acting as that key barrier between mum and fetus, which is like, I mean, that blows your mind, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-blowing. And it's really interesting because there's still two sides here. There's still a side that says there's no placental microbiome. It was just, when we did the testing, there must have been some sort of contaminants. And then there's others that are like, no, absolutely. Because some of the microbes that we find on, unfortunately, preterm birth, where there's kind of placental abruption or there's problems there, are often things like Fusobacterium nucleatum, which is a commensal in the mouth, or Campylobacter rectus, which is another commensal in the mouth. So it's like, it is kind of thinking, well, how did they get there? And often it's kind of moving through the system and they get to the placenta in that way and possibly set up an infection. But much more research going on in that area too.
This is a watch this space, isn't it? Definitely,
absolutely.
With the mouth and fertility. Are there any other key bacteria in the mouth that are sort of the really big ones you need to know, for any of our listeners?
There's lots of bacteria that live in your mouth. So there's lots of commensal bacteria.
And by the way, commensal, we mean healthy.
Yeah. Lots of healthy bacteria. But basically, what we're often looking for in the mouth is if that bacterial colony has gone towards more pathogen, which are the more ones that are going to cause damage. And one is kind of Enterococcus faecalis is quite common in the mouth. That can be associated with root canal infections and abscesses. So when we find that one, that's often can be, yes, it can kind of be transient there, but often it's associated with deeper infections that can be a problem as well. And there are many different bacteria that can be associated with kind of gum disease and decay as well. So it's often we're looking for those too.
Wow, that's brilliant. Okay, so I think the burning question right now, which I'm sure everyone's sat there like shaking, saying, please ask, how do we support our oral microbiome?
Oral or all of them?
Let's start with oral, and then we'll go down into the gut. I guess obviously we can talk a little bit more about probiotics and prebiotics soon.
Yep.
But why don't we talk a little bit about specifically what we can do on a day-to-day basis and any other little tips and tricks you've got for the oral microbiome?
So the oral microbiome, very similar to the gut, it's what you feed it. So it's just making sure that you are having a diet that's very, very rich in prebiotics, which means feeding the bacteria. And when I say prebiotics, the most common one is dietary fiber. But actually, when it comes to the mouth, because there's not that much time to digest fiber, we're often looking at something known as polyphenols. And what polyphenols are plant chemicals. They're very, very high in many sort of plants that we ingest, things like tea, coffee, lots of different green plants, blue plants, orange plants, those really colourful plants that we ingest. And these polyphenols are prebiotic in nature. So your bacteria gets hold of them, eats them and grows and flourishes. So that's what we want to expose them to. In the mouth, it is definitely eating less sugar because, it changes the acidity of the mouth. That feeds colonies that will change the acidity of the mouth, that then leaches the calcium out of the teeth instead of putting it back in, which a healthy colony normally does. It's a kind of a circular economy. And it's also making sure you're doing good teeth hygiene. So do clean your teeth like you should, a couple of times a day. Do floss, do use a water pick. Some people do coconut oil pulling. That's and you don't necessarily need to use antimicrobial things in your mouth unless you have got an infection. So again, it's just being really cautious about, what sort of mouthwashes you're using, what sort of toothpaste you're using, these sort of things. Kind of thinking of, yes, we want to kind of break up the biofilms in the mouth often so they resettle to a kind of a healthy bacteria, but we don't necessarily want to go in and keep nuking things because that's not good for a microbiome either.
And is the part of the issue with if we go in and we work a little bit too heavily, that you could also sort of overspill the fragments of the broken bacteria? Is that potentially an concern?
Absolutely. So if you're doing kind of antimicrobial stuff too often, yes, if your barrier is not good, that's going to get into your system and cause more inflammation. That's a possibility. But also long-term assault to the microbiome is an assault to the microbiome. You're going to really struggle with is it your commensals regrowing, or is it the other, who's winning, the commensals or the pathogens? So it's just really thinking about, how do I feed my commensals? How do I nourish myself?
Right.
Is often the question we need to ask.
Interesting. Okay. And you mentioned about toothpaste and mouthwash. So what are the things that we should be doing and shouldn't be doing?
Looking out for things like SLS in your toothpaste. You don't need it in there. It's generally causes more gum damage than it should. You may or may not need essential oils. Essential oils are brilliant if you've got a microbial infection, but long-term use of them again might be too antimicrobial and also cause gum damage. Fluoride is a big contentious one that I won't comment on. Your dentist and you can have a chat about that one. But there's different kind of things that you can use, like hydroxy calcium apatite, which is kind of what the teeth, the calcium is made of in there. It can be really, really helpful as well, and really nourishing to the enamel and so on and so forth as well. Drinking green tea. Green tea is a wonderful prebiotic. So that's another thing that can be used, or you can use as a mouthwash. Using probiotic mouthwashes as well if you do need to break up biofilms. All of these sort of things can be considered.
That's amazing. Thank you for explaining that. And the polyphenols, obviously, you mentioned before, as well as feeding the bacteria, are also good at reducing inflammation. So it's quite a nice way, if there is any inflammation in your gut, which of course there may often be, if there is kind of an imbalance in these microbes, that's a nice way of just keeping those down a little bit as well.
Absolutely. That the beautiful thing about polyphenols is, so there's the plant chemicals, which is basically a sugar portion and the kind of the chemical, let's use that word, portion together, which is the most active bit. So what the bacteria does is it cleaves off the sugar portion that it used for itself. And when I say sugar, I'm not necessarily meaning like white table sugar. I mean a kind of a natural fiber that it eats. And then the portion that's left over is generally the anti-inflammatory, antioxidant component that then we absorb and we can use. So there's this double benefit. We feed the microbiome, and then we're liberated with this kind of, amazing polyphenols that we've heard of for heart health, for anti-aging, for skin health, for so on and so forth as well.
I think you sold it at anti-aging. Most people are ordering polyphenol supplements right now. Okay, so if we now come down a little bit lower, because like you said, the gut is a very long tube and we're starting in the mouth, but if we go down into the rest of our digestive system, talking more about the gut microbiome, how would you be supporting that? I guess the polyphenols we mentioned about kind of cleaning the diet up a little bit there, but expand a little bit more on what we'll be doing here.
Yeah, so definitely exposing yourself to whole foods. So cooking as much as you can from scratch, avoiding ultra processed foods if possible. I know it's not always possible, but kind of thinking about all of the things that have got a detrimental effect. So things like the emulsifiers or the sweeteners, all the things that you don't really need in your diet, but yet you can cook a lot of stuff from scratch. And what you're doing is you're going to give yourself the opportunity, especially if it's kind of rich in polyphenols and rich in fiber, to really feed and nourish your microbiome. And we also want to expose ourselves to foods that have got microbes in them. So traditionally, it's only really been since we've invented refrigeration that we haven't relied on microbes so much to store our food and to keep our food. So we don't have as much microbial exposure in our food as we used to. So eating the more traditional fermented foods is actually a beautiful way of exposing your gut microbiome and your immune system to all these wonderful metabolites and microbes and things that will have a really, really big impact as well. So, and this can be done cheaply. It doesn't necessarily have to be these boutique cool foods that are out these days. You can do a lot of the fermenting your home yourself, or, even some of the simple yogurts that you buy from the store. If you do eat dairy, just making sure it's pot set so that the bacteria are within the kind of the pot that you're buying. Or it could be if you've got leftover fruit and vegetables and you're like, what am I going to do with these? Reducing food waste. You can think about fermenting, you can think about pickling, you can think about doing these things that are both good for the environment, good for your pocket, and also really good for our microbiomes as well.
Great advice. And then you've got kind of the sauerkrauts and the kimchis and the kefirs and kombucha, all the kind of stuff that gets spoken about a lot now.
Yep.
In terms of probiotic supplements, this is obviously a big area. It's a big industry. What are the things that people need to know about probiotic supplements?
So probiotics are amazing at sort of, especially when you've had an insult to health, or an insult to your microbiome, and you're thinking, actually, what can I do to kind of get myself well again? And hopefully, you're doing all the other things we've spoken about dietary wise and interacting with the environment. But probiotics, a lot of the research on them is quite specific. So there's so many different species. Not even species. There's so many different strains. So we can have a Lactobacillus acidophilus, and it could have a different strain, one strain different to another, which is the last third name on it. It generally has a couple of numbers behind it. Can act very, very differently on how it metabolizes and what it then does in our body. So if you're picking probiotics to use for health, it's always really good to think, okay, what's my concern? Like, what is it that is happening in my body? Do I want a probiotic that's good for my gut barrier? Let's look at ones that have got studies on my gut barrier. Do I want a probiotic that's be implicated in mood? Let's look at the studies, including the strain numbers, that might be good for mood as well. Yes, you can take a generic probiotic. It's not going to hurt you. It's going to improve the general milieu. But actually, if you're using them therapeutically, I would say, use ones that are kind of you've seen in studies that can be really, really helpful for what it is you're suffering with at that time.
Makes total sense. And in terms of quantity, because obviously there's a lot in terms of the quantity, how many billions of bacteria are in there, what should people be looking for there?
Again, that's really, really specific to what you're using them for, because actually you'll find in most studies, they'll say, in this study in IBS, we used this specific species at this, I can't even say it, specific dose. So what we're looking for is a dose that matches generally the research. So not always does more equal better. Often we think that, the more that it is, the better it is. And yes, great. Again, if you're taking a daily, everyday one for no specific reason, then maybe more is a good thing. But actually, in many of the cases, it's kind of matching, what did they use in that study and did it work? So
that's really interesting. You also mentioned before about, for example, if you wanted a probiotic for mood, you might take a certain probiotic. I think it's a good connection we're highlighting there. We hear a lot about this gut-brain connection. Mm-hmm. It's obviously quite a big, hotly spoken topic at the moment. Tell us a bit more about the role of bacteria in terms of mood, in terms of, the brain and the nervous system. What's the connection all about?
Oh, that's a great question, because there's quite a big connection there. So bacteria in our gut make metabolites, like we've said, and some of the metabolites they can make are things like neurotransmitters, and they can communicate with our nervous system, which goes straight back up to our brain and kind of have an impact on what's going on transmission-wise in our brain. We can also, some of the different metabolites we make can make things like tryptophan, for example, more accessible. And tryptophan is needed to make serotonin. So they play a really big role in making sure we're getting the right bit we need to go and do things as well. A lot of these bacteria can communicate directly with the vagus nerve, which is the one that goes from our brain, wanders all the way down into kind of our stomach and into our large and small intestine. And there can be a direct communication back with the central nervous system as well. So it can, again, regulate from that way. And the final way is the one we've also spoken about before, is through that sort of low-grade chronic inflammation. Because we know a lot of mental health conditions like depression often have that low-grade chronic inflammation in the background as well. So looking at the gut microbiota and making sure it's nice and balanced and that we've got a good microbial gut barrier can reduce some of that low-grade chronic kindling that's going on too. And that changes the way that your brain functions.
It's just amazing, isn't it? It really is. I know anxiety is another big one that, you often see gut dysbiosis, and you can use certain probiotics to kind of balance out certain types of neurotransmitters, and that can have an impact as well. So there's so much here that we can use. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, and I meant to ask you about before, was inflammatory bowel disease. Mm-hmm. So for those listening, inflammatory bowel disease basically encompasses two conditions, which is Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, two very common diseases, and naturopathic medicine, natural medicine has a huge role to play here. And from my understanding, there's a lot of knowledge that we've gained in terms of what role the microbiome might play in those conditions and therefore how we can approach them too. Would you just tell us a little bit about all of that?
Sure. So what's really interesting in inflammatory bowel disease is we see when we look at kind of microbiome analysis, so, we look at the stool and we look at the patterns of the microbes that are growing, there are really unique sets of patterns of growth of certain microbes that kind of seem to feed the inflammatory cascade and cause that sort of, it's a cat and mouse game really of like who's causing what. Like, was it the inflammation caused the changes in the microbes, or is it the microbes that's caused the inflammation, or a bit of both? So we find often with recovery, the microbiome changes again as well. So, and that's often what we're looking for is, can we encourage that change in the microbiome to be much more of an anti-inflammatory picture, one that can kind of help to calm down that inflammation. And again, that can be used alongside traditional medicine or pharmaceutical medicines as needed. It's that sort of, can we make a microbiome intervention basically in the hope that it's going to help in remission and recovery.
That makes sense. And I guess this is realistically where doing some form of testing does help.
Yes.
If you've got somebody with inflammatory bowel disease, to actually go in, have a proper look at this, at this gut, at what's going on in the microbiome. Is there inflammation? Is there permeability problems, etc.? It just gives you a whole deeper understanding. And I did want to ask this actually, because I think for some people listening, they probably have had a stool test before by their doctor. So just to explain, when we're evaluating one's microbiome using the sort of testing we're talking about, how does that differ from a stool test that maybe a doctor would run?
So generally what the NHS or someone will run is a more pathogen-focused stool test, which is great if you've got acute symptoms. So if you've got, you've just come back from 2 weeks traveling, you've got really acute symptoms, or you've had food poisoning, what it's trying to rule out is the really big food poisoning pathogens basically, or big parasites that are quite common. And so that's great from a pathogen point of view, but that doesn't tell us anything about your commensal microbiome. Then we're not testing any of those in those acute tests. That's only done if you're kind of looking at a fuller DNA analysis basically. And so that's where you can become a little bit more about using stool testing, not just as a diagnostic tool, do you have this or do you not have this, but more as a supportive screening mechanism, really, to go, how can I improve my health? How can I be more proactive in feeding my microbiome? What is it that I've got or I don't have that I need to encourage in my system? And I think that gives you much more power as a patient to kind of go, okay, yeah, it's not necessarily I do this test and I get treated with an antibiotic. Sometimes that happens. Occasionally we find a nasty pathogen, but most of the time it's like, what can I do in my diet to really make a specific impact? What specific sort of changes do I need to make that's going to really, really help me on my journey?
Yeah. And there's no doubt that these tests are complex.
Yes.
They are, very technical, and that's why you can only obtain these via a practitioner. Because obviously, if you were to supply them straight to a patient, it would just be letters on a page. It wouldn't mean anything at all. So they are very technical. Just to put that out there in case somebody was trying to order one as we speak. Okay, I wanted to ask you as well, Debbie, about other things that you can do in terms of supporting your gut microbiome, and for example, things like fasting or other things. What else would you be recommending your patients?
So yeah, fasting is an interesting one. And again, there's more information kind of coming out on that one day by day in both directions. So that's a curious one. But equally, it's what you are exposing yourself to in the home. So it is really, we've talked about food is a really important one. We've talked about fermenting food as well. So exposure to fermented food. But also, are you interacting with green spaces? Because green spaces is just breathing in spores of bacteria that are really important. Have you detoxed your kind of cleaning cupboard to make sure it's not really, really high in super antimicrobials, and gone for more kind of slightly more natural antimicrobials? Are you making sure that you're interacting with pets? Are you interacting with family members in a kind of a healthy way socially? it's thinking about all of the kind of the wider system is really another way of kind of improving your gut microbiome too.
Fantastic. I think it really does come back, doesn't it, to making sure that we get the exposure that we need to have, that we get the diversity. And I think diversity is a key word from this podcast. And, what we're saying is that the more diverse a gut microbiome we have, the better generally it will be, as long as we've obviously got nice healthy species in there.
Yeah. So
you're hoping I was going to say
Yeah. I was going to say diversity is an interesting one, because we normally go diversity equates health. It does and it doesn't. It depends on the diversity. But yes, like any community, the more diverse and inclusive the community, the better. So.
And one interesting area, of course, to look at is the vagina, because the vagina is one area where diversity isn't necessarily what we're striving for. So would you like to tell us a little bit about what the vaginal microbiome is and what I was referring to there?
Yeah, sure. So one of my favorite microbiomes to talk about. So the vaginal microbiome, the vagina is obviously its own ecological niche, because it has its own food source that comes from vaginal secretions. So we actually have a lot of food for microbes like glycogen in our vaginal secretions, which attract a certain type of bacteria. And that's generally lactobacilli species in most women of reproductive years. That's the kind of the more dominant species in the space. And their presence makes metabolites that crowd out other bacteria from growing. So you'll normally find a healthy vaginal microbiome will be quite dominant in certain species of lactobacilli. Now that can be different for different type of women. Will have different affinities with different species of lactobacilli or different bacteria in different areas culturally as well. But generally you'll find that it's not a super diverse area. There is still diversity, but there is kind of one big group that takes over most of the space. And it's so interesting. Again, we make the food to feed them, to attract them there, because of the beneficial impacts that they have for the vaginal space.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And obviously when we talk about lactobacillus, one of the interesting things is how it helps to keep the vaginal pH quite low, which basically means that it keeps it quite acidic.
Yes. Tell
us a little bit about that and why having a more acidic pH in the vagina is important.
So by keeping the lactobacilli make hydrogen peroxide, which is the same thing you dye your hair with. And basically what that does is that acidity will stop other each microbe will have its kind of sweet spot of what it likes to grow in, whether that's acid or alkaline environment. And so by creating a very acid environment in the vagina, it will stop other bacteria that are often more pathogenic from growing. So it can reduce the chances of kind of picking up bacterial infections basically in the vagina.
Interesting. So could somebody just do a vaginal pH test just at home, just to see, just as a bit of a gauge really, for whether it appears to be that the lactobacillus are keeping the pH low?
Absolutely. You can buy some of these over the counter at places like Boots and things like that, or even off, some of the major online suppliers like Amazon or something along those lines will sell kind of vaginal test strips. And what we're looking for is again, the key word is in reproductive age. So we're looking for a nice acidic pH, which is generally around 3.8 to 4.5. So that will come up on a color change that you'll have a look at it will have like a scale that you'll have a look at. And you can measure any day of the month apart from if you're menstruating. And we normally say the day of ovulation is best not to either, because you can get a bit of a alkaline spike on that day in some cases, but generally any other day of the cycle. And that will give you a bit of an idea, like you say, if there is an imbalance in the vagina, because normally when we have vaginal dysbiosis, in many cases it will move to a much more alkaline pH, so kind of towards 5, 6 or 7. And that gives you a good key in to go, oh, maybe I need to do something about this or investigate further.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, so what would imbalance the vaginal microbiome? What are we really looking for here?
So there are many things that can impact the vaginal microbiome, and we've got to think systemically again. So things like our immune system, our blood sugar balance, all of these things, whether or not you smoking can really have an impact on the vaginal microbiome as well. So all of these things in itself can impact it from a systemic point of view. Locally, we also want to think about intercourse and the way that that's done and people's partners and so on and so forth, because actually, that's another source of microbe insult in some cases, or in some cases help. So it's just really thinking about all of those things that can have a play in the vaginal microbiome.
What about something like the copper coil, for example? Would that be potentially causing any problems?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting stuff around the copper coil. And again, there seems to be two camps around it, but it does seem to, the string that attaches to the copper coil does seem to attract biofilms. And in some cases that can be bacteria associated with bacterial vaginosis, or also the fungi Candida, which causes thrush. So in some people, yes, the copper coil can cause a problem in disrupting the local microbiome, as well as the copper itself basically can too.
What about lubricants? Are they potentially problematic for the vaginal microbiome?
Lubricants, condoms and what's in the condoms, all these sort of things can really, really have an impact, both positive or negatively. So it is really thinking about you want a lubricant that is kind of the same density and osmolarity as the vaginal secretions, and therefore that can really help the vaginal microbiome, or it can help the tissue in the area as well. And we also want to think, is there, the kind of the types of materials that condoms are made from, and so on and so forth. So, and there are many, many options out there. There's some wonderful natural brands out there these days that can, and ones that are pH balanced or, osmolarity balanced, that can be really, really helpful.
Right. So that's what people need to be looking out for, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Okay, so you mentioned the term there, bacterial vaginosis, which we often just abbreviate to BV. This is, extremely common to see. What is that, and how would somebody know if they're experiencing BV?
So BV is a change in the vaginal microbiome to a group of bacteria that generally do live there, but they just become more dominant. So they push the lactobacillus species down and they become more dominant. And what we can get is there can be itching or burning in some cases. Some people might not get too many symptoms, but also there can be a real change in smell is a big one as well. So, and that can really be off-putting for a lot of women. They kind of really get worried about it, or it can really impact like their comfort as well. But bacterial vaginosis can be also associated with frequent miscarriages and infertility and things like that as well. So it can be quite important when you're thinking about a preconception care program to kind of think, is my vaginal microbiome in a good state?
Right. Okay. And then thrush. How does thrush compare to that, if you could explain?
So thrush is an overgrowth of Candida, generally albicans, but it can be any of the Candida species in the vaginal microbiome. And the thrush is very, very opportunistic. So this is, again, generally when there's a change in the bacteria, it can set up, or if we've had antibiotics, or if the immune system is really low, is the most common reason for it to set up. And what that can create is kind of local inflammation, and that's where you get the pain and the itching and the redness, and again, generally a whitish sort of discharge as well, which can be a hallmark of it.
I think, and as well, the point about it being opportunistic is key, right? Because, in a case history, if you ask your average female, have you ever had vaginal thrush before? The likelihood is that they will say, yeah, I have. I have it on a monthly basis. I've had it a few times previously. It's extremely common, to a point I feel as though it's almost normalized a little bit, that this is just like, oh yeah, every now and again, but it's all okay. But if we go back to our terrain theory from that perspective, what that's screaming out at us is that the environment that we're bathing these bacteria in is simply allowing this opportunistic bug to have a little bit too much of a party.
Yeah, absolutely, because Candida we all have it. Everyone has it in their gut, on their skin, vaginally, in really tiny, tiny amounts. But our immune system keeps on top of it, our microbiomes keep on top of it. So any of these microbes or fungi that overgrow is only because of opportunity. So that's where, sometimes in the past there used to be lots of these anti-candida diets, or let's nuke the candida. And yes, you might have to reduce it a bit with some antifungals, but it's more looking, like you say, at the terrain. How can we build the person back up, get the immune functioning well again? Because actually your body has the capability to keep on top of it.
Yeah. 100%. It just needs to be given the ingredients, right? Fertility, you mentioned as well, of course, before. This is a really important one. And I know you actually helped us to write some of our material on fertility and when we were looking at the microbiome. So I know we had a good conversation about this then. But there's actually quite a lot of research out there in terms of how the vaginal microbiome can be implicated in fertility.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's expanding as well. There was a really big study done recently by Tommy's, which is a baby loss charity. And there'd been previous studies to this as well, but they really brought this to the fore, where they showed that women that were having pregnancy loss and if they excluded the ones that they knew it was because of DNA reasons, so it was the unexpected or unknown pregnancy loss, they found that they had much less lactobacilli in their vagina. So there's a real correlation between kind of bacterial imbalance in the vagina and more likely pregnancy loss in early stages. So they found this a really amazing thing that, basically we can really make a difference on kind of healthy pregnancies and full-term pregnancies by really looking after the vaginal microbiome.
And it's so powerful because a lot of people have been on a really long, difficult struggle with their fertility, and this is an area that a lot of people haven't looked at because it's so new. We're only learning about it now, and I feel like this could be that missing piece of the jigsaw for a lot of people that they haven't quite looked at, or they haven't really put two and two together in terms of their recurrent BV, for example, and how that might be sort of playing a role here.
So the other microbiomes in fertility can be really important as well. So the gut microbiome, like we spoke about earlier, where that low-grade chronic inflammation that can impact lots of places in the body, can impact the reproductive system in cases of things like endometriosis. The oral microbiome and if there's any kind of bacteria moving through the system as well, like we spoke about earlier, may impact things like the placental microbiome in unknown ways at the moment. So there's lots to think about with all the microbiomes when we're looking at unexplained infertility and how we can kind of support that journey forward.
It's completely fascinating. And what we're seeing is that these ecosystems are communicating. That's amazing. Again, I know sometimes there is a tendency to look at everything in isolation, yes. But this isn't how it works, right? Even in the microbiomes, the oral microbiome is so closely tied to the gut microbiome. It's so closely tied to the vaginal microbiome. And I know we were speaking recently about the seminal microbiome, which of course we're really just at the beginning of understanding at the moment. But seminal fluid or semen, we are learning, has its own microbiome as well, and that this can in fact support conception.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating. And like you say, we're really at the beginning of this journey of thinking, how does the microbes in the semen interplay with, the sperm getting to the egg and so on and so forth. Incredible. So watch this space.
Yeah, watch this space. This will be the next podcast.
Yeah.
So in terms of supporting the vaginal microbiome, let's say you've got somebody that's got recurrent bacterial vaginosis, there's something there that needs support. What are the sort of typical things that you would be looking to do?
So the first thing, like the gut, we're going to go back to looking at, the diet and the impact that that's having. So we're going to remove anything that could be damaging the vaginal microbiome. Smoking's a big one, chemicals, anything that's knocking down the immune system. We're going to pull those out of the diet, and we're going to feed you a polyphenol-rich diet with lots of fiber in it. But what's really important for the vaginal microbiome is making sure we've got access to lots of lactobacilli. And that could be either through taking probiotic supplements that are specifically have strains in that do reach the vagina. Don't ask me how they do it, but they do. We can test and we see that they show up in the vagina, even if it's just for a few transient weeks while your own lactobacilli improve. And we can really look at kind of things that things like your tampon usage or moon cups or anything that's being used, that making sure that you're changing them often, that they're getting sterilized, all of these sort of things as well. But we find that exposure to the lactobacilli is super important at kind of really improving the vaginal microbiome in many cases.
And do you ever use like capsules of this intravaginally, for example?
Yes, we do. Yeah. And so you can use, again, as long as you're choosing strains that are specific to the vaginal area, such as Lactobacillus crispatus or sometimes Lactobacillus gasseri and so on and so forth. They can be used intravaginally as long as there's no other excipients in there as well. And, this is because for years people used to apply yogurt when they had thrush and things like that. And the way was to try and get the lactobacilli. But nowadays we have capsules and it can be a lot easier and less messy.
Wow. And I think the great thing now, of course, Debbie, is that we've got access to great probiotics. We have so much more research, so we understand this field so much more. But like you said, it is ever changing. We're learning more constantly. So of course we have to kind of keep on top of that. And actually, I wanted to mention just on this topic, a case that you supported me on in my practice when a little while ago now, where I had a patient with very ongoing chronic bacterial vaginosis. And this was a lady in her early 20s. So lovely, came in really just desperate. She had tried every antibiotic. She'd been to her doctor, just was not getting answers. And she was at the point where it was impacting her relationships. There was lots going on, and it was kind of impacting her mental health. And what we did was a vaginal microbiome panel. And I was a bit surprised by the results, I have to say. So I rang up Debbie and I said, look, can I just talk these results through with you? They just seem pretty bad to me, to be honest. And Debbie, there was a pause on the phone and you went, yeah, they're not particularly great. And this is quite severe bacterial vaginosis. And, I'm not surprised that she's getting the symptoms. And everything you sort of explained made perfect sense. She was getting a lot of discharge. And on the results we got, there was huge amounts of inflammation. If you remember, the inflammatory marker was really high. And you were sort of explaining that with inflammation, we get the cells breaking down, and that can actually be part of that discharge. Anyway, we talked the case through. I put her on a plan. Her lactobacillus basically was not there, and she had all these other pathogens. There was way too much diversity, so we kind of focused on removing those, but very quickly putting in the lactobacillus. And within a couple of months, she was virtually symptom-free.
That's fantastic.
It was just amazing. And it was a really special case because this is somebody that basically couldn't sustain a relationship anymore. It was having a huge impact on her life, on her work. She really just thought, this is it now. I've had this for years. There's nothing else I'm going to be able to do. And basically within 2 months, she's symptom free. So it's a very powerful area. And obviously having now seen this even more with clients since, it's important that we do this podcast.
Yeah. And, again, it's that beauty of now that we've got the testing, we can look for the good bacteria, not just the pathogenic ones. That really does help us, doesn't it, to come in and make a specific treatment plan to go, let's get those lactobacilli up. Let's kind of change your diet to do that without guessing. And that really, I'm so glad it made a difference.
Well, thank you for your help. And I'm interested to hear from you just now to conclude the podcast. Is there a case that you can think of that's sort of a really great microbiome example, one that just made you sort of go, wow, this was fantastic, or something that sticks in your mind?
Oh goodness, I'm very, very lucky to hear of hundreds of cases every day, and I'm constantly moved by people when they really do kind of embrace and make changes and kind of trust that actually it's not X equals Y, it's like X equals Y, Z and K. It's this thing of I can make all of these changes in my life and it can actually have a really, really big impact. One we heard of the other day, which really moved us, again, another vaginal case, was someone that had lost a baby really, really sadly at stillborn at 38 weeks and had lots of problems. And with her practitioner's help and looking at the vaginal microbiome and getting the right treatments and being really specific, they were able to really make sure that her next pregnancy was a healthy one and take her the whole way through. And it just, that's what it's about. It brings joy to me that, people are kind of getting these things in their life that they want, to move forward. So
it's an amazing story. And I think that will resonate with a lot of people, because as we know, there are a lot of people out there that are coming to listen to podcasts like these because they're just looking for answers. And I have to say, Debbie, that I think you've probably given a lot of answers today. And I just want to thank you. It's a pleasure. I mean, I get to speak to you all the time, but it is genuinely a pleasure just to have a sit down with you to talk this through. And I hope that our listeners have taken in a lot, and I have no doubt that they will have.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this topic, so I'm always happy when someone wants to chat to me about it.
Oh, amazing, Debbie. Thank you so much, and I'll speak to you soon. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a future episode.